Hello, my name is Janet Higgerty, and in behalf of First Church of Christ Scientist in McLean, Virginia, welcome. A while ago, I was searching on the internet, and I came upon a home for sale that really got my attention, and it got me to thinking about how we go about making change for the better. As I clicked through the images of the home there on the internet, I was very impressed with what I was seeing. It was a century home that had been very beautifully redecorated. All of the appliances were brought up to date, and the color scheme was just beautiful. Well, I continued to look at the photos when I suddenly came upon one that didn't look anything like it belonged in that house. It was quite in disarray. And wondering what that was, I went down into the advertising copy to learn a little bit more about the home. And there I saw that the house, as magnificent as it was, it had a structural issue. When they were redecorating, they had decided to make the living room larger. And so they removed a load-bearing wall. They just took it out, and it happened to be an original exterior wall. Now you can do this, but you have to have the help of an engineer to restore that structure. But this hadn't been done. So even though so much of the home was totally beautiful, it was actually leaning very severely to one side. And I realized, looking at that home, that until someone comes along and does the work of restoring that structure, fixing that structural issue, no matter how beautiful that home is, it won't be fit to live in. Well, this got me to thinking about how we often go about trying to make change for the better in our lives. We often go all in for the redecorating. Oh, we might get some new clothes, or we might update our resume and start to look for a new job. Maybe we stop by the doctor to try to update a prescription and allow us to have some temporary relief from an ongoing difficulty that we've been having. But to make real substantive change in our lives, change that restores our sense of security, change that increases our happiness and improves our health, we really need to address the structural issues of our life. And that's what we're going to be doing together today. We'll be looking at 4 big ideas that help us to restore the structure that is upholding good in our lives. The first idea that we'll talk about is what kind of a foundation our lives are built on and why that matters. And the second idea we'll talk about is how our connection to this foundation can never be severed. The third idea that we'll talk about today is the stuff we're made of and why that matters. And the fourth idea that we'll address is how we can prove the powerlessness of anything that would try to shake or harm us in our lives. Well, we don't have a physical foundation like a building does. When we come to understand the foundation that our lives are built on and the power that is upholding goodness in our lives, this provides us with a real sound foundation on which we can make change for the better in our lives. I'd like to begin by sharing the story of how I discovered a new perspective on what our foundation is. my mother-in-law gave me a copy of this magazine, the Christian Science Sentinel. And as I paged through it, I observed that the magazine was made up of articles that were written by people like you and I, just everyday people. And these people had applied the ideas of Christian Science, which is what we'll be talking about today, to meet many different kinds of needs in their lives. Well, as I paged through, one article in particular caught my attention. It was an article by a woman who was talking about how she had prayed when she was having challenges with food and the digestion of it. Well, I thought that might be interesting to me because when I was about 10 years old, I was diagnosed with an allergy to chocolate. Well, as a child, this was certainly very disappointing to me because I really liked chocolate. And it became a little bit worse when the doctor told my parents that the solution for an allergy to chocolate at that time was that I needed to stop eating chocolate. So I thought, well, maybe this article here in the Sentinel would have some different sorts of ideas for me that would be helpful. As I started to read the article, I discovered that the ideas that were shared were coming from this book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures by Mary Baker Eddy. And this book talks about the relevance of the Bible to our lives today. So all of the ideas that were being shown were ideas that come from the Bible and are based on what the Bible teaches. The first thing that really grabbed my attention was how the article was explaining the nature of God. It talked about God in a different way than what I was familiar with. At that time, I kind of thought of God as being a big man in the sky who was maybe sometimes good and maybe other times not so good. But what this article was telling me about, that there's a biblical basis to the understanding that God is all good and all powerful at all times. Well, this was a new idea to me, the idea that God was all good. I'd heard about God being all powerful, and I had somewhat of an understanding of that. But the idea that God was all good all the time, without any reservations and without any exceptions, was really a tremendous new idea to me. And the article also said that this all good God was the source of our being, the foundation that our lives are built on. Well, I thought this was wonderful because if God, who is all good, is the source of our being, then indeed I had to be good because I came from goodness. And this was very meaningful to me because previous to reading that article, I had thought, well, I may be good. I want to be good. That certainly is everyone's natural desire to be good, especially knowing that we come from an all good source. But I wasn't sure whether I would be good, whether life would be a positive, hopeful, and good experience for me. Well, it was so meaningful to me to think about that I came from an all good foundation that I really felt, even while I was reading that article, a change coming over my thinking. I started to feel a real deeper, more secure and hopeful sense about my life and everything that it included. That is why I call that big idea number one, that God is all powerful and all good, and that this all powerful, all good God is the source of our being, the source of everyone's life, the source of everyone's existence. Well, now I realize maybe not everyone who's listening today is a student of the Bible, and that is totally okay. I'm just really here to share some ideas with you about God and about our true being that have been helpful to me. And I hope along the way you might also find a new idea, a new perspective that will be helpful to you in your life. I continued to read the article, and what I found as I proceeded in reading was that a very logical statement that an all good God, who is the source of all reality, would not make any of its creation to be in conflict with another part of its creation. Well, this was very logical to me because I thought that goodness would certainly harmonize everything in the creation. And it made me think that maybe there was some real hope for me when it comes to overcoming that allergy to chocolate. Because it was telling me that God, being all good, made me all good and made everything that surrounds me in the environment, including food, good. And that I can't be deficient in any way to cause an allergy, and that there can't be anything in the creation that is toxic and harmful to me. That reminded me of this statement that Jesus makes in the Sermon on the Mount when he says, "Take no thought for your life, what ye shall eat or what ye shall drink, nor yet for your body what ye shall put on. Is not the life more than meat, and the body than raiment?" I was impressed to see how these ideas that I was learning about that day in the Sentinel were really biblically based. Well, I finished the article, and these articles really don't take very long to read at all. And after I put the article down, a very interesting thing happened a little bit later on in the day. Someone offered me a little box of chocolates. And I paused when they offered this, and I remembered what I had read in that article. And I thought, there really isn't any reason to believe that those chocolates are toxic or could be harmful to me. And I decided that I would try out what I was learning. And I ate the chocolates. It was a small box, but I enjoyed the entire box. And the wonderful thing was that I didn't have any reaction whatsoever to that chocolate. And I have continued to test this out for many years since that time. And I have never had any further allergic reaction to chocolate. Now, this was a fun change in my life. But the ideas that I learned that day went even further into making positive change in my life. That idea that I came from a good source was really very powerful to me, and it inspired me to have much more conviction about everything I did, because I could feel that I had a solid foundation that I was building on, and that foundation was permanent, it was unchanging, and it was all good. And it was literally upholding goodness in my life. after a little while, I even noticed that I was physically stronger than had ever felt previously in my life. Well, some people might say that you can outgrow an allergy over time, but I don't feel that that's what happened here, and I want to go on and tell you why. Mainly because I have seen the powerful impact of these healing ideas in so many people's lives, and that have brought real substantial change, improved their health, and, and improved everything in their lives. And so I know that what took place that day was really solid, powerful healing. And I want to just go a little deeper to kind of show you how that happened. Many people today are on a spiritual search. They're looking for something that is reliable, something that they can depend on, a solid foundation. And I found this foundation in the Bible. The Bible tells us that God is spirit. So for me, everything that is spiritual proceeds from this all good, all powerful God that is the source of everyone's being, the source of your being. Well, in the Bible, there's an interesting idea that's introduced right in the opening passage. It says, "In the beginning, God," and then it goes on to talk about everything that God created. And I want to talk for just a minute about this word beginning, because I found it to be very informative. I used to think that when I would read that we might find out sometime when this all began, when everything came into being. But I eventually realized that that word beginning refers to the source or the origin of a thing. And in the Latin and Spanish translation of the Bible, the word beginning is translated principio, which also means the source or the origin or the principle of a thing. And the English word principle means the basis from which something proceeds, or the government behind something. So in thinking about this, in the beginning, God, and studying Christian Science and what it teaches, I started to discover that God is a governing principle, not at all that big man in the sky concept that I once had, but a consistent, reliable, powerful, all-powerful governing principle that brought all good into being and that upholds everything that is good in our lives and in the world. Divine principle, God, is the source of reality, you might say. Well, I really appreciated that thought very much and find that it even made that foundation for me seem bigger because it was eternal and infinite foundation that is ever available for everyone. The second chapter of the Bible gives us a very different perspective, and I just want to briefly kind of try to reconcile these two perspectives. The first chapter that I just talked about gives us the spiritual perspective of creation that proceeds from an all-good, all-powerful God. And that first chapter describes all of the good that constitutes the creation. The second chapter has a different purpose. The second chapter is showing us what could happen if we lose hold on that spiritual sense of creation. How we might start thinking that we could fail, or that we could be ill, or that others could fail or be ill. And what the second chapter is showing us is the importance of staying close to our spiritual foundation and not getting pulled into the concept that existence is matter-based rather than spirit-based, rather than coming from God. Remember, the Bible says God is spirit, and our being is spiritual. You know, a lot of the world, and even folks that don't read the Bible, think of existence as this mixture of good and evil, spirit and matter. And that was really where I was in my life and in my thinking when I first saw the article that I have told you about in the Sentinel. And I was thinking that every day was either going to be maybe good or maybe not. And so this really gave me a sense of as if I was stuck in place, like I was spinning my wheels, or like my life was a tug of war between good things and bad things, and that I was helpless to determine what it was going to be, as if everything was left up to chance. And you see this in the world thought today. You hear a lot about genes. You know, that's one way people look at their life expectations, that it's determined by the quality of their physical genes. And some people are happy because they've been told they have very good genes, and so they expect to have a long and healthy life. And other people are fearful because they are afraid that they have bad genes and that this is going to cause them continual sickness. Again, it's the idea that life could be left up to random chance. But these two chapters in the Bible, the first and the second chapter, are saying, you know, the reality is that all good comes from one and only source, God, who is spirit and is a governing principle upholding goodness in the world. So you could look at your spiritual practice in one of two ways. You might think of it as a way to help you through this world that is a mixture of good and bad, and that it, you know, your prayers can help you to keep your head above the water, you might say, and get through all this until you come to some future time. Some people might call it heaven, where you find everything is good there. Or your spiritual practice could be for the purpose of proving that spiritual perspective of life that I've talked about. The life that proceeds from an all-good, all-powerful, divine principle, love, and that goodness is our nature. Goodness is our foundational principle, and that we can prove this, and we can prove that God is upholding goodness in our lives and in the world at large. Well, that second perspective is what I've found to be a very healing and powerful perspective, and a wonderful way to live, to endeavor to understand the nature of God and to prove the present power of God at work in our lives. You know, there's many ways to pray, and one of the ways of prayer that I have really found powerful and helpful is really studying the Bible, reading it, and also reading this book, Science and Health. And these two books go together very well. And they really are always pointing us to that spiritual reality of being. So they help to uplift our thought. So prayer can be a kind of study, a kind of thinking, looking for new ideas in the Bible and seeing how those ideas apply to our lives. It's something that is really a joyous daily activity that we can engage in. So it's not so much a kind of predetermined set of words that we repeat, when I'm talking about prayer anyway. It is an inspired communion of learning the nature of God and of becoming more and more acquainted with the presence and power of God that is at work in our lives. I'd like to share another healing experience that I had that helped me to understand big idea number 2, which is how our connection to our foundation will never be severed. We can never be separated from our all-good, all-powerful foundation, from God. I became very ill at one point, and I had been relying on Christian Science for all of my physical well-being, my financial well-being, the health and happiness of my family for many years by the time this particular illness came up. And so I felt very confident that I could rely on my prayers only to find a healing solution. Well, this sickness was such that I wasn't able to really get out of bed for several days. I was feeling very ill and very poorly. And so I took my time during this period of time to look again more deeply into what Christian Science was telling me about my existence, about the nature of God and about the nature of God's creation, and also the Bible. And during these days, though there was physical discomfort, I did find a great deal of comfort in the prayers, the study during that time. Before I became ill, I had had a career derailment, you might say. I had been working on a project that I really loved and I was very invested in for some time, and I intended to continue to do that work for quite a while. However, some of the other people that were working on the same project with me told lies about me. And the lies were such that it put an end to that project, put an end to the work that I was doing. Well, this was quite a surprise to me, and I never did understand why they did this. But I surely did feel that what I had been doing in my life had abruptly changed. And it was evident that there was no going back and restoring this situation. Well, after about a week, I was still unable to get up and do any normal activity. And I was really reaching out to God with all my heart to discern the truth of being, to discern my present goodness and health and harmony. And as I prayed, an interesting thought occurred to me. And that thought was that even though unethical people had told lies about me that had put an end to my career as I had understood it at that time, God had not stopped upholding his goodness in my life. That was a tremendous new idea, and it was a tremendous relief for me. And when that thought came to me that God had never stopped upholding his goodness in my life, I realized that I had been accepting the idea that the evil actions of these other folks had in fact won. I was accepting the idea that in that case, evil had won. But this fresh spiritual idea really woke me up from that. And I thought, oh, this is wonderful. That's right. God never stops loving his creation. And God never stops and never will stop upholding goodness in my life. Well, right away, I felt better. And by the end of that day, I started to feel freedom to get up and start picking up the house and having a sense of going forward. And by the end of the next day, I was completely free of all of the symptoms that had kept me in bed for such a long time. This is a real point at our security, you know. God is our foundation, and that foundation is permanent. We can't be separated from it. God doesn't stop upholding his goodness and empowering it in our lives. No one can interfere with that because God is love. And love just loves. And this upholding of goodness in our lives is God loving us. So it's not even so much about what we're doing, is it? It's really about what God is doing. We can't be separated from that foundation because God is love. And God will always love persistently and tenderly and perfectly each and every one of us. Well, I was physically healed at that point, and I didn't know where my job prospects were going, but I did have a conviction and an expectation that they were going to go someplace, that something would come that would be progressive for me. And that's exactly what did happen. Within a year's time, I had a new job that really, I loved it more than what I had been doing previously. And it allowed for me to progress in many different directions. It allowed for me to even do the work that I love to do in a more broad fashion. So it was a full and complete healing in that sense, both physical healing and the job healing. And an interesting sidebar, during that same year while the new job came and I got settled into it, I met some very interesting people during that time. And these people became really hard, fast friends for me. And they enriched my life in so many ways. And thinking about this as time went on, I realized that makes sense because my healing was a result of my perceiving the goodness of God and the power of it in my life more clearly. And so it went throughout my entire life, you know, my physical, my employment, and my social life, you might say, that also enlarged and expanded because I was perceiving more clearly the almighty power of God that is at work in all of us. Mary Baker Eddy discovered Christian Science in the second half of the 1800s, and she wrote her discovery down in this book, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But the words Christian Science are helpful to understand The science that she discovered is what I've been talking about. The power of God at work in our lives, the divine principle that is upholding and manifesting good in the universe and in our individual lives. The Christian part of Christian Science refers to the life of Christ Jesus that we read about in the Bible. And Christ Jesus gave us a unique insight into the nature of God as love. He showed us through the healing works that he did the power of that love to bring healing to humanity. That love coming to us is sometimes referred to as the Christ, and Jesus is also referred to as Christ Jesus. So it's like a title for Jesus, and it specifically is referring to the way in which God meets the human need. And even though Jesus isn't with us personally anymore, that Christ activity, that love of God loving us, continues and always will continue. One thing that I really love about Christ Jesus' life is the way that he always had great conviction that everyone had a reason to hope. He didn't block anyone out of that. He always pointed the way to hope and healing. One healing that he did is particularly significant to me. He came upon a leper one day. Leprosy was a disease that is very contagious. It's feared, it's very contagious. And because of the contagion in Jesus' day, they would have people who had the misfortune to give the appearance of having leprosy to have to live out of town. They had to go away from everyone else. They had to stop everything they were doing, and they lived with the rest of the lepers because everyone was very afraid to be in close proximity with them. Well, Jesus' hopefulness really came through when he met this leper that day. When the man came and greeted Jesus, Jesus did an amazing thing. Jesus touched the man without any fear, without any doubt or questioning of what he was doing. He touched him as if you might a dear friend, someone you haven't seen in a while. You might put your hand on their shoulder and just smile at them admiringly and greet them. Well, this fearless touch reached beyond the physical aspect and touched this man's thought. Jesus was not afraid. He was not indicating that there was anything to be afraid of being in contact with this man. Jesus must have been admiring the man's true nature as God had made him. Good, indestructible, whole, healthy. And this reached that man's thought and lifted him out of the fear of leprosy. And he was immediately healed. As you can kind of see a theme developing here, all of these healings that I've shared have indicated that the thought has changed. Thought has gone from perceiving oneself as being a sick mortal to perceiving oneself as being a beautiful expression of God. The healing that I talked about with the allergy, you'll remember that the thing that brought the healing of that allergy was when I changed my concept of self from one of being struggling between good and evil to realizing that I had a good foundation that I was planted on, and that my life was upheld by Almighty God's goodness. And the healing that I had of the physical problem and the job derailment came when I understood that my connection to that foundation could never be severed, that there wasn't anything that anyone or that I could do or that the world could do that could separate me from the love of God and the power of God to bring out good in my life. And here we are with this healing of the leper. Jesus showed that man that he was whole and not fearsome, that he was good. And the man felt that. The man's thought changed, and he was healed of the leprosy. And this brings us to big idea number 3, which is the stuff we're made of and why that matters. If thought, uplifted, brings physical healing, that shows us that we are spiritual, that we are 100% what God knows about us, 100% what God has created, all good, wholesome, pure, loving people. And this brings physical healing, even though our thought is what is uplifted. We're 100% spiritual, 100% what God knows and what God has created. Now, this idea may seem pretty radical, but if you think about these healings, which were solid proofs of this, it's worth considering the possibility that we're 100% spiritual. This idea came to Mary Baker Eddy through her study of the Bible and through experiences that she had in her life. And I want to jump in at one point of her life. This is before she had discovered this revolutionary idea. She was a young woman, but also a widow at this time. And she wrote a letter to her sister, kind of explaining her situation. And she said to her sister, "I am weary, working my way through life from the middle to the end. I want to learn to play on a piano so that I can go south and teach. 'Tis all I shall ever be able to do," she said. She wrote this in 1848. Well, going forward in her life, she continued to try to make progress beyond that. She was a widow and didn't have any way to sustain herself at that time. She also was in poor health. And so she tried many available health systems at that time to see if she could find health. But none of them gave her complete healing. Some, maybe for a time, made things better, but then the problems would return. She continued to search and expect that at some point she would find real healing in her life. She married a second time, as she had lost her first husband. And her second husband, though he was a good man, he eventually started to be unfaithful. And this was a very difficult challenge and disappointment to her. So, as she had always done, she went to her Bible to look for comfort, to look for help, encouragement, guidance. And this did, help her to a degree, but she continued to have many challenges in her life. And this came to a crisis when she was involved in an accident. And the accident was such that they didn't expect her to be able to walk, and there was some question if she would survive. And her friends had gathered around where she was being taken care of, just to be a support to her. Well, at this time, she did what she had done all through her life. She picked up her Bible again, and she opened the Bible to one of the healings that Jesus had done. And while she was reading that and really open-heartedly praying, wanting to progress, wanting to know God better, she had a new idea, that she was touched by that Christ Spirit, the love of God that I've talked about. And she describes that experience this way. She says, "It was a glimpse of the great fact that I have since tried to make plain to others, namely, life in and of spirit. This life being the sole reality of existence." Well, she pondered that idea, and it was so powerful and clear as it came to her thought that day that she felt she was able to get out of that bed and to walk. And she did that. She got dressed, she walked out of the room, surprised her friends greatly. And she went forward in life from that point, endeavoring to understand what had taken place in her experience. She wanted to know if this was something that could be repeated, if this was something that other people could experience. And so she searched her Bible. She was looking for things in the Bible that would correspond with the experience that she had, studying Jesus's healings and just getting everything that she could out of the Bible. And she started to find what she called positive rules that gave her conviction that the experience she had was something that was repeatable. During this time, people in the community started coming to her for healing. And she healed a man who was deaf. He had a return of his hearing. She healed a little boy who had never walked, and he was restored. He was able to walk and run with the other boys his age in complete freedom. She knew that she had discovered something that the world needed, and so she devoted the rest of her life to making this available to the world. She wrote down what she discovered in this book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. She started the magazine that I showed you, Christian Science Sentinel. She also started another magazine, the Christian Science Journal, and a group of magazines, the Christian Science Herald, that is published in many different languages. She gave talks herself. She eventually established a church, like the church that's sponsoring this talk today, First Church of Christ Scientist. And she just really gave everything over to making her discovery available for ever, on and on. She wanted to be sure that it was available for everyone. But there's one thing she didn't do. She never learned to play on the piano. But we can surely forgive her for that, because what she did do has changed the world for the better and continues to do so. One idea that she brings out in her book is it's a challenging idea. It can be challenging. I found it challenging when I first came upon it, but I realized what a powerful, forward moving idea it is for us as individuals and for the world at large. She says, God is not the creator of an evil mind. We must learn that evil is the awful deception and unreality of existence. That's a big statement, but it makes sense because if our objective is to prove the goodness of God, the all power of goodness, then we really can't at the same time be agreeing that evil or badness can have any reality to it or any creator. And that was what I needed to learn in that one healing, that evil had not won and that evil could not win. And it surely was proved that it did not win, even though everything that I saw in my experience, pointed to that evil had power and was destructive. If you think about it, though, anything that we would label as badness or evil really comes from ignorance and from fear. And ignorance and fear do not come from God, because God is all good. And Jesus showed us the goodness of God. Jesus never encouraged us to be afraid. He said, fear not, fear not. He said that in so many cases. So how do we do this? How do we overcome this belief of evil, especially on a day like today when we're hearing the news out of Brooklyn, New York yesterday that there was a mass shooting at a grocery store. These things are so heart-rending. They really are. And your love goes out to the individuals involved, and we all yearn to see this sort of thing stopped, that to see it overcome before it is appearing in our world. But we can, even at a time like this, when we're facing such a tragedy as this, reach out for the pure and perfect concept of God's perfect goodness. Knowing that God has never given any power to any thought that would encourage anyone to do such horrible things. We can see that there is a possibility of overcoming this. There is a possibility of rising above it, all of us as a world together, and helping one another to know and experience that which is real, which is what comes from God, which is all good. When we do it thought by thought in our own lives, we watch carefully to rule out any bit of hatred trying to creep into our consciousness and to, replace it with a consciousness of the power of God, the power of love. The light of love casts out hatred. And in our prayers for the world, we can make that same stand. That goodness is the only power, not just the biggest power, but it's the only power. And anything unlike goodness is truly powerless. Well, before we close today, I'd like to share a healing that helped me to start going in the direction of really seeing the potential that we have to prove the the powerlessness of anything that would try to shake or harm us in our lives. One night, very deep in the night, it was probably 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, I finally suddenly found myself awake. And as I waited there, I thought, oh, I think there must have been some sort of a big sound or something that woke me up. And that started to get me a little bit concerned that maybe someone someplace in the neighborhood was breaking into something. Well, I felt that I didn't hear any more noises at that point, so I felt the best thing that I could do to contribute to the good of the situation was to pray. And that's what I did. And first I wanted to handle the fear that I was feeling. And so I was thinking about that nature of God as being a governing principle, and God being spirit, being ever present everywhere. I thought, well, God and God's goodness is fully present right here in the room where I am. It's fully present in every room of my house. It's fully present outside my home. And the goodness and the power of God is fully present everywhere in this neighborhood, even where that big noise had happened that jarred me awake. God's goodness had to be there too, because God is infinite, ever present, all powerful. Well, this helped me to calm down quite a bit. But then the thought came to me, well, you're kind of implying that somebody must be a thief if you're saying somebody, if you're fearing that somebody broke into something. So I again thought about that, and I realized my mistake there in my reasoning, because an all good God surely didn't create a class of people to be thieves. That wouldn't make any sense. An all good, all powerful God has created everyone good like itself. Everyone is built on this good foundation. And their lives proceed from goodness. Their source is goodness. So they have to be good. God surely wasn't giving anyone the idea that they needed to steal from someone else in order to have their needs met. And I was grateful to have this clearer thought about the nature of all people, and to realize that thieves were not a God-endowed creation, that there were no thieves by nature. Well, it was late at night, and I was thinking I would like to go back to sleep. I felt like I'd covered things. But as I closed my eyes, a very strong thought came to me, and it demanded an answer. And the thought was, how could those prayers help if someone has already stolen something? Wow. So I didn't know how to answer that. I couldn't imagine how to answer that question, but it demanded an answer. So I just remained quiet and listening and hoping that there would be an answer that would come to me. And an answer did come to me that was really quite moving to me. And the thought that came to me that night was that if someone had made a mistake and taken something, that God would not abandon that person and leave them to their mistake, but that God would continue to communicate to that individual good ideas, the right ideas. Perhaps something like, put those things down. I'll show you a better way. I'll show you the right way for your life to be provided for. Well, I felt a really deep sense of love touching me that night, because this concept of mistake was something, that, we all, I guess, come across ourselves and feel like we've made a mistake. And the idea that when we do make a mistake, even if it's just, being rude or angry with someone, even if it's not stealing something, the idea that God is right there showing us how to untangle this mess we just made was just wonderful to me. To know how pure and perfect that love of God is, that it has no condemnation in it, that it's always building us up, it's always strengthening us, it's always pointing us in the right direction. So I was deeply touched by this love that night, so much so that I felt that my time of praying there that evening had really finished with a great, wonderful idea. It had made me see that love, God, was bigger than I had realized before. I found out about the depth and the power of love. Well, I went on to sleep and really forgot about this whole episode until the next morning when I left my home and one of the neighbors came down the sidewalk, and she was very in earnest to talk to me. And she wanted to know if I'd heard about what had happened the night before. And I remembered the noise, but I said, "Oh, no, what happened?" And she said, "Well, the garage next to my home was broken into." And I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And she said, "No, no," no. She stopped me mid-sentence, really, and she said, "That's not the end of the story." And I said, "Well, oh, really? What happened?" She said, "Well, there were several items that were taken out of the garage." But she said the strange thing was all of the items that were taken out of the garage were found 3 houses away, further down the street, and they'd all been dropped in the front lawn. And by this time, everything had been returned to her garage and everything had been accounted for, and there was nothing missing, nothing damaged. So she was thrilled about this, and I was just, again, feeling that love that I felt the night before, because I realized that powerful love that had touched me and had shown me a deeper, bigger sense of God must have also reached whoever that was that had broken into that garage and caused them to change their direction, to put those items down and to go find a new way of living. Well, again, this really touched me, and it made me think about, the power of the prayers, all of our prayers, our collective prayers, and really what they are doing in the world. It's kind of like if you're in a room and it's a sunny day out, but all the shades are closed in the room that you're in. And if one person goes over and opens the shade, that light that comes in, it doesn't just come on to the person who opened the shade. It comes to everyone in the room. So when we are praying, even though it might just be, in the dark of the night, when we're praying, we are opening that shade. And that light comes in and it reaches others. And that's really what I felt happened that particular night. And it gave me a much deeper understanding of the importance of our prayers for the world and all the individuals in it, and for the power of prayers to change the world for the better. This instance is big idea number 4 that I had talked about, that we can prove the powerlessness of anything that would try to shake or harm us. And as we go forward today with that idea and thinking of this recent shooting, it occurs to me to really embrace all individuals in the world in my prayers as I endeavor to understand the goodness that is my being, Well, that has to be the same for everyone. And knowing that goodness and love of God must be felt and known in everyone's life. You know, that God does love each and every one of us individually and powerfully, fully. That divine principle manifests goodness in all life. And this kind of prayer can help uplift people who may be feeling very much alone, very much alienated. It does help because what we're doing is we're being a witness to the power of God at work. We're being a witness to the reality of all goodness. So I'm so grateful that all of you joined us this evening to share these ideas. And I'm so grateful to know that you are all praying too, and that we can change the world for the better through our prayers. Just before I say goodbye this afternoon, I wanted to mention that there'll be a slide that'll come up, and it will tell you how you can contact the church in McLean, Virginia. If you have any questions, you can contact them by telephone or through their email. And it also tells you about their church services if you'd like to join them, either by way of Zoom or in person. It gives you the times of their church services. And if you're calling from someplace outside of Virginia and you would like more information, well, you can still call Virginia, but you could also look at ChristianScience.com, which has a lot more information about Christian Science available for you. So again, thank you for spending a little bit of time together here this evening, and thanks so much to First Church of Christ Scientist in McLean, Virginia, who has sponsored this talk today. Well, bye-bye.